Hey YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Got a bit of a special report into just what a draconian PoLice state Australia has become in this past 20 years since the successive gazetting of ever harsher anti-terrorist laws.
Since 9/11, Australian government, state and federal, have passed a lot of anti-terror legislation, usually with bipartisan support and often without much parliamentary scrutiny or debate. Preventing terrorism is without doubt important, but do anti-terror laws strike the right balance between individual liberties and security imperatives? That's a question raised squarely by the case of George Dixon, an often homeless man who, by his own account, is a prolific long-term user of marijuana, and he regards himself as a political activist for drug law reform. George Dixon's legal misadventures are the subject of a new article in The Monthly called The Aquarian Terrorist, which is written by former Sunday Extra host Hugh Wilmington. The article features another luminary of Australian journalism, Mark Davis. You might remember Mark as the Gold Walkley winning investigative journalist on programs like Four Corners and Dateline on SBS. These days, Mark is a criminal lawyer, and he's been George Dixon's legal aid funded lawyer as his client ended up being categorised as, quote, a high-risk terrorist offender and subjected to a series of control orders. Mark Davis, welcome to Sunday Extra.
Hello, John.
Could you give us a quick outline of George Dixon's life story before he was subject to a control order?
Well, nothing out of the ordinary, except that he does have I'm wary of using the word fixation, but his primary interest in life, his primary political interest in life is drug reform. He's a marijuana user himself, and he's advocated for its decriminalisation for well over a decade.
And I suppose it's the particular way that he's expressed that advocacy which has caused him problems. Could you sort of characterise how he goes about this activism?
Look, really, it wasn't his activism that led him to the attention of the police. So his activism was a prolific writer, and a frequent writer of offensive emails to various politicians in Australia and police. So that's his modus operandi. And many leaflets stuck on, power poles. That's probably what he's done, essentially, over the last 10 years. But what tripped him up was this. He's in Nimbin, of all places. The guy's in Nimbin, and police decide to do a drug raid. He's found with shock horror, he's found to be in possession of marijuana at the Nimbin Marijuana Festival. He gets taken to Lismore, down the mountain, taken to Lismore. He's charged, then released. And he's released in the middle of the night, maybe 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, I think it might have been. He's got scant clothing on. He's got no shoes. It's cold. And it's a 30-kilometre walk back up the mountain, and they won't drive him. So he's, irate. He goes outside, he picks up a rock, and he smashes the windscreen of 2 police cars. There's no police in the cars. That's the beginning of his journey on a very terrifying journey, and I mean terrifying for us all, not just for George Dixon.
I mean, obviously, throwing a rock at a police car is going to get you in some sort of trouble, but it does. The connection to anti-terror laws is not obvious. Could you help sort of chart the link for us, and in particular, what this term terrorism context means in New South Wales law?
Well, what it means is you don't have to be a terrorist. Incredibly. You don't have to be a terrorist to come under the Terrorism High Risk Offender Act. And this was frequently mentioned in proceedings, almost in passing, almost like, well, no one's saying he's a terrorist, but he's going to get a terrorist high risk offender order upon him.
Yeah, so that definition of terrorism context says you've just got to have the intention of advancing a political, religious, or ideological cause, and the intention of coercing or influencing by intimidation governments. And George Dixon, some of his more colourful statements err into that territory. But still, how does he end up being charged and treated under this legislation?
Because it's a checklist. It's a checklist for predictive crimes. Now, we're really entering new space here when you don't commit an offence, but the experts, the men and women in white coats, when they have a checklist, they start to predict that you're going to commit a crime. Now, that's the most chilling thing you can sort of comprehend as a lawyer or as anybody, that we've entered this stage of predicting crimes. And you get a little number between 1 and 5 of your chance of committing a terrorist offence. And for George, of course, the checklist, even when we look at it, it seems benign, but the checklist is as follows. In court, he said, I believe in Aboriginal law, not the laws of the invader. Fairly commonly held view by many people in Australia, in fact. And yet, of course, to somebody in the system, it sounds a bit like ISIS, doesn't it? ISIS believes in the caliphate.
Well, that's a political statement, I suppose, that involves the government and the jurisdiction of Australia. So, yeah, you can see how it's
and then strike two, he advocates for the smoking of marijuana. Now, that's an illegal offence, isn't it? So that's strike 2. That's striking with the laws of Australia. And so he's strike 3. Apart from having been previously been an annoying person to politicians and police, he's strike 3. But I think this was a construct. I'm not satisfied there was any serious concern about this. I felt like it was just the third tick in the box. In prison, in a group session, he said, and he says he said it as a joke, that he should have burnt down the police station, not just broken the windows. And then he's alleged to have said, I should burn down all the police stations of in New South Wales. Now, he says it was a joke amongst 20 inmates, and everyone was joining in on that joke. Now, I can promise you from the number of times I've spent in prison, there are many such jokes in prisons of all places.
Fairly robust jokes made in prison.
Yes. And that was his strike 3. And then the train began, and that train wasn't going to stop until, he was, ultimately he was freed, but they were hoping that he would not be freed. He came under the Act. The Act hadn't been in for very long. The Act came in at the very last weeks of 2017, and George came within its ambit by 2018.
We're speaking here about the Terrorism High Risk Offenders Act 2017 New South Wales, and we're discussing it with former Gold Walkley winning journalist and now criminal lawyer Mark Davis, whose client George Dixon fell afoul of that legislation. Mark, when he got out, George was subjected to a control order, so he hadn't committed any new offences. But what did that control order mean for his life?
So the Act provides for either the continuing detention, without a further offence, the continuing detention of an inmate, or a control order. Now, the control order is a bracelet on your leg. You are confined to a certain residence. You are monitored by all means. You're not allowed to have a computer or email, smartphone, any of those sort of things. Now, but for George, it was particularly onerous. The assumption or the legislation assumes, okay, you've been in prison, you're released, you go home, but we want to keep an eye on you. Now, that sounds sort of reasonable on one level. George doesn't live in New South Wales. George is from Adelaide. He gets arrested and then he's taken to police, to prison in Sydney. It's not a city he knows. He knows no one here. He's got no home to go to. He can't return to Adelaide. They put him in a homeless shelter. He can't. He asked me, am I able to, rent a house or something of that nature? He didn't have much money. And I said, well, under the Act, technically you are, but to do that, he needs to declare that he's a terrorist high-risk offender to his housemates and the police, which is not going to do well on Gumtree.
No, exactly, yeah. It's not a great opener for your tenancy interview, is it? No.
Yeah. And then the police need to vet every person you come into contact with. And in fact, he needed to give them a weekly schedule. If he wanted to meet someone, indeed, if he wanted to go and have a cup of coffee, he had to tell them a week ahead. and they have this entire team of the High Risk Offenders Unit, very large, very well-funded team that approve everything he needs to do. It's an absurd order, and a particularly absurd order for an innocent man.
So Mark, why was this order granted? I mean, you might understand the authorities applying for it, even if that was a misjudgment. But why was the order granted?
The interim order, you get an interim order for 3 months, and they are, well, the way the Act is written, there's not much discretion on behalf of the judge. He is to give full weight to everything that the police say, right? So it's not scrutinised in any particular way. So the idea is, okay, well, for 3 months we'll do it, and then we'll have a final hearing. So what happened to George was, of course, he got the interim order. His wife was held for 3 months, and when we finally got him into a courtroom, we got him off. But in those 3 months, just as a personal detail, George is about to be released from prison. His father is dying. George, of course, tells me, I tell the police, oh, look, his father's dying. He wants to go back to Adelaide. Well, there's a process, of course. Oh, okay. Well, they wouldn't let him go back to Adelaide. His father dies. They wouldn't let him go to the funeral. Now, this is an innocent man. They would not let him go to the funeral. His father died thinking that his son was a terrorist. He couldn't explain to his dad what George barely understood it himself, what was going on. Yeah. All his father knew in his dying days was his son had been labelled a terrorist. And then his father dies, and George spends the day of his father's funeral in a homeless shelter in Western Sydney with police outside, plainclothes police sitting in a car outside his house.
Extraordinary.
It's pretty shocking.
The obvious problem here is the legislation itself and how broadly it can be applied. Are you aware of other cases of these sorts of control orders being granted in places you just wouldn't expect them to be?
Well, there's been very few, because the Act's very new, so it takes a while to sort of grind through. I mean, look, I'm aware of a couple where I think any reasonable person, I mean, I don't agree with this law. I think it's outrageous to have predictive crimes, and they're based upon the, I mean, I think, again, disgracefully, on health professionals who are now embedded in the police system, who do these little analyses, these little checklists, and they come up with a number. It's pretty creepy stuff, predicting that you're going to offend. Now, some of these people, I agree, well, I'm glad someone's watching them. I'd put it as high as that. I'm glad someone's watching them. I'm glad the police are checking on them. Well, I think they could have done that anyway, rather than bringing in such a draconian piece of legislation that not only has been misapplied, in my view, in fact, has been misapplied in George Dixon's case, it will continue to be misapplied. Yeah, it's very dangerous stuff.
And that's the risk, I suppose. The creep from when I think control orders were used against, say, David Hicks when he came back from Guantanamo Bay, people who've been detained of actually plotting terrorism offences. But it seems that the legislation itself allows for much broader use of these laws.
Actual terrorists, please. Yeah. You've got to be an actual terrorist. Might be a good start, right?
Yeah. And I mean, is there any sense from the authorities on the other side that this was a misstep and an abuse of the process? Because just because the law exists doesn't mean that it needs to be used to the full extent of its breadth.
Well, I can tell you, Julian, and I'm not speaking out of school, there's a large number of people. George probably had 20 people whose full-time job, was circulating around this dangerous terrorist. I could tell that they thought this was absurd themselves, right? But that didn't give much comfort to me. They still went ahead with it. They still did this job. Yeah. They still refused him going to his father's funeral. I know what they felt. Yeah. But, well, it's a job, right? Yeah. We all do our job.
And look, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Mark Davis, thank you very much for doing both your jobs today as a lawyer and a journalist. It's been great speaking with you about the very concerning case of George Dixon.
Thanks, John.
I'm Julian Morrow. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Julian Morrow. Famous comedian from program The Chaser. As I think I've mentioned previously, married to my cousin's daughter. But I've never spoken to him in person or on the telephone. Never met the bloke. But just know that, he's one of the clan. the Wharton clan sort of thing, more or less. This business of anybody who advocates changing Australian law by coercion for ideological or religious reasons being a terrorist, it's kind of bullshit. It's a refinement on the anti-terrorism laws that John Howard brought in response to 2 aeroplanes hitting 2 buildings and 3 buildings falling down in 2001. I think there have been at least 2 or 3 waves of extra strengthening to those laws. And yeah, now we see the situation where somebody who's already annoyed a bunch of politicians and police commanders, administrators, commissioners, whatever, by emailing them on matters of drug law reform, the Goon Squad goes to the Nimbin pot smoking festival, and presumably because he's identified himself as an incipient agitator, the goons know what he looks like, so when they see him, they give him the full treatment, which is a ride down the mountain and then get released in the middle of the night. Got to walk home. The fact that they let you out means you're actually supposed to accept the fact that that's what they are paid to do, and if you go outside their script, then they will jump on your head with their biggest, ugliest hobnail boots. And yeah, that's what's happened to this bloke. He wants to change the law because he believes the law needs to be changed. He's advocated and committed acts of violence, therefore he's not a terrorist, but he meets the criterion under which the prosecutor can ask the magistrate or the judge, make one of these orders because you have no choice, because, pink pigs in blue suits theory, I think they call it. Rank hath its privilege. Turns out not to work particularly well in the long term, as they're finding out in the excited status of Norte armed Americano. But yeah, while we're on the topic of Black Lives Matter and all that sort of stuff, this fella said in court that he believes in Aboriginal law, not the law of the invaders. That's one of the reasons they described him as a terrorist. They didn't say that he is Aboriginal, just that he believes in Aboriginal law. So yeah, I feel a sense of fellow travellerism, if not actual brotherhood, with this bloke, because, I was raised as a white fella in New South Wales, and I've been paying attention to the New South Wales PoLice service since before it became a force, back in the days when they had revolvers. And, if they wanted to fire a round through their revolver, except on the range, they had to fill out a weight of paperwork equal to the weight of the ammunition expended. So they were very, very careful. They didn't fire their guns very often at all. That was back in the days when the postage stamps were really dull and boring, and the economy was really strong, and the policemen wore dull, boring uniforms, and they were constrained to act upon the complaints of the public rather than run around trying to predict who was going to do something bad and persecute them in advance, just in case they were going to think about it. We have moved on from then. In the excited status of Norte armed Americano, apparently in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the town has voted to get rid of their police force. They're just going to stop funding it. They're not going to have a local police. America's run differently to Australia. In Australia, we have no police run by the town council. In Australia, we don't have elections for the local magistrate. We don't have a judge, town judge. We don't have elections for the local prosecutor. We have elections for the councillors, the people who are sitting on the town council. They go into a room and they have an election among themselves, and they elect the mayor and the deputy mayor. The population doesn't elect the mayor. The population certainly doesn't elect the prosecutor. They don't elect the chief of police, and the town council does not employ any police. The whole state of New South Wales is locally policed under the same state law. Each state has its own police force. There is a federal police force, and they do everything in the Australian Capital Territory, and they also run around dealing with interstate criminal events that no individual state can deal with on their own, kind of sort of thing. And then above that, we have the Australian Secret Intelligence Organisation, and they are Australian spies who spy on Australians inside the nation. And then we have ASIS, the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, and they are Australian spies who roam the world spying on other people. And I think during Mr. Turnbull's time as the Prime Muppet, Peter Dutton got made the Minister for Internal Affairs and Security. And all of those forces, they all rise up to his desk, and he's the person who's in charge of painting Australia as such a bunch of fucking arseholes that nobody wants to get in a rowing boat and sail to Australia, because we've still got UN certified refugees locked up in concentration camps that we pay for out in the Western Pacific, north of New Guinea. Manus Island and Nauru, technically part of Papua New Guinea. We have extraterritorial concentration camps there, run by private contractors. Because successive governments of ours have been kind of arseholes ever since John Howard won the election in 2001 or something. Might have been the 1990, yeah. He won a big election basically by claiming that refugees were throwing their babies out of boats in order to have the babies rescued. And he lied to the Australian population, and then we've gone really, really hard on refugees ever since. Yeah, Peter Dutton, the Minister for Internal Affairs and Security, he's in charge of all that sort of shit. And we recently, last weekend, the Queen announced a whole bundle of gongs, and instead of people who'd actually done anything, this year, Scott Morrison, ScoMo, alias Slow-Mo, his administration has handed out all of the Queen's birthday awards, or not all of them, but bloody near all of them, to politicians and bureaucrats. Julie Bishop and Tony Abbott got the highest award, the AC, I think absolute cunt or something like that. Anyway, Peter Dutton's head of department, the bloke who a couple of days ago literally described himself on ABC radio as being the head of Australia's secret police. He got one of these ACs as well. He's also an absolute cunt, just like Tony Abbott and Julie Bishop. Julie Bishop, who got sort of thrown out of Parliament because of Choppergate, where she directed, ordered and required a government-funded chartered helicopter to take her to a Liberal Party fundraising event. You know, like, she got thrown out for fucking corruption, and she got a gong from the Queen, the highest gong you can get. Yeah. This is what went on in Australia in the week that America was rioting after protesting while rebelling on the issue of Black Lives Mattering. After those, well, I would say one ran interference while three of them killed him, because, you know, like, one person pushed down on his abdomen. He's handcuffed face down on the concrete. One pushes down on his abdomen, one pushes down on his back, on his ribcage, another one kneels on his neck. He can't expand his lungs far enough to move more than one little puff of air up and down inside his trachea and his bronchia. It's not getting out, doing any gas exchange in the bronchioles and the alveoli at the end of the terminal bronchioles. So yeah, they suffocated him to death, leaving no bruises. Very cunning. And America went off because, you know, they have lots of problems with police extrajudicially killing people between apprehending them on the street and yelling, "Stop, you're under arrest," and getting them into court in front of the magistrate or judge so that they can be let go on bail or held on remand or whatever, they have this fairly high rate of killing people. Excuse me. Well, here in Australia, we don't hear it reported particularly loudly, but since 2001, no, 1991, well, maybe it is 2001, maybe it's only 19 years, we've had 430 Aboriginal deaths in custody. And I'm fairly certain that's not people who just happened to die in jail because they were old and they were in jail. Or maybe that's including them. Maybe they notice somebody's about to die and they let them out on parole and let them die at home or something. I'm not sure, but 430 cases where Aborigines have died in custody, and most of them seem to take the flavour of either people being apprehended for something that's not very much, and then they get beaten up, and then they get thrown in a cell, and sometimes they die of the beating, and sometimes they fall over and hit their head on the concrete. One particular lady, they had video camera of her falling over and hitting her head on the concrete several times after being put in a cell because she was asleep on a train seat and had her feet on the seat. So the conductor radioed ahead and had the cops take her off the train, and they put her in a cell and she died. That's a death in custody as I understand it. I think the deaths in custody are between being grabbed by the police and being handed over to the corrective services after a court case. Well, 430 in, it's either 19 or 29 years. It sort of works out at 15 a year. And I don't know how many non-Aboriginal deaths in custody there are, because they happen too. And an American viewer and subscriber of mine asked me in the comment thread on my video about General Mattis declaring Trumpy a threat to the Constitution. He said, what are the cops like over there in Australia? And I had to think fairly hard to answer it because, as I said, I was raised white in a little country town where Dad was in business for himself and Mum was a school teacher. So I grew up as the privileged species. And my car's registered. I've got a gold licence because I haven't had a traffic matter since about 1982. I haven't got any outstanding rates or anything like that, but the police computer probably shouldn't show rates. And that's all kind of important because about 5-6 years ago, the New South Wales Police announced that you didn't have to have a registration sticker on the windscreen of your car anymore because for about 2 or 3 years, all their highway patrol vehicles had 3 cameras on them. And those cameras had already picked up at least 11 photos of every vehicle that was registered in New South Wales. And their camera was connected to the computer, which had a satellite link to a computer in Sydney. And that computer in Sydney was a big mainframe that sort of knew everything about everybody. So a policeman could be sitting at a traffic light, and while he's sitting there waiting for the light to change, his computer tells him that the car 2 in front and 1 row to the left attended a Hell's Angel funeral last weekend, and it's registered to a bloke who's got a list of violence convictions. So you might want to go over and be very careful while you search his boot. They've got that level of real-time intelligence. So when I go for a drive, I'm within 20 kilometres of where the car is registered to be garaged, and I'm in the New South Wales Fire Brigade, so that's probably on their list of things displayed. And it's a local area, so they know that my son's captain of the fire brigade, so I don't get any scrutiny at all. I'm fairly sure the police come down harder on Aboriginals than they come down on white fellas, because that hasn't changed. But if I cast my mind back over the past, say, 40-45 years, I've only heard of 2 instances where there's been any stories and scuttlebutt getting around at all whatsoever to the effect that a policeman has killed somebody rather than arrest them and bring them into court. And one of them, the story was told to me by a renowned bullshit artist and a fantasist, and I don't believe him because it doesn't go in harmony with what I know about the character of the particular policeman concerned. So I think that's bullshit. The other one, everything I know is that when I came back from being in Sydney, there was a story about a youngster riding a motorcycle being chased at night by a policeman up a rural road, and the motorcycle accidentally collided with the police car, and the motorcyclist died, and the policeman was transferred out of town by 6 o'clock the next morning. And, therefore he didn't face any lynch mobs or vigilante action, but everybody was firmly convinced that he had actually run into this motorcyclist rather than just follow him and get his number plate and catch up with him later on in the weekend sort of thing, like ring up his parents and ask them to bring him into the station. So, yeah, okay, in 40 or 45 years, there have been 2 stories. Oh, forgive the interruptions of the telephone, but I had to answer that one as my little old, aged 84-year-old matriarch. Yeah, so as I think I was saying, in 40 or 45 years, there's only been 2 stories of a local cop, within what I consider my home territory, which is halfway from Glen Innes to Inverell, halfway from Glen Innes to Grafton, halfway from Glen Innes to Tenterfield, and probably down around about Ben Lomond, sort of halfway to Guyra. That's what I think of as my home territory, because it's where I grew up. Another little patch of it extended out there at Red Rock, because we used to go there for holidays 3 times a year, because Dad had a house there since 1948. But in that little area, really only 2 stories of a cop killing somebody rather than bringing them in and fingerprinting them and putting them through the justice system, or the just us system, however you want to pronounce that one. And one of those stories is bullshit, I'm fairly certain of. The other one, I think it might have been exactly the way the scuttlebutt and the rumour network had it. But here's the salient factor. In both cases, it was a white cop and a white teenager. So, in answer to the American who asked, what are the cops like in Australia? Well, they don't have revolvers anymore. They have 16-shot Glocks. And they have tasers. And they have capsicane spray. And they have knife-resistant, cut-resistant, bulletproof vests. And sometimes they're in a bulletproof vest and sometimes they're in a cut-resistant vest. But the cut-resistant vests are actually harnessed to spread the load of all the crap they're carrying on them, because they've got a radio and handcuffs and spare ammunition for their bloody death seed projector and all that sort of stuff. And they don't seem to like going out on their own. And all this is because somewhere around Tamworth, one crazy person shot one cop, like at a roadside breath test or something like that. And that's a thing that it doesn't often happen in Australia. Specifically compared to America, for two or three reasons. One of the reasons is that in Australia, it's very hard to get a handgun. You've got to do it illegally, or you've got to jump through so many hoops that you're not going to do anything silly with it because it was so hard to get it and so expensive to get it. But our cars, we have the steering wheel on the right-hand side of the car when you're going forward. And that means that when the cop comes up to the driver's side window, if you've got a gun hidden underneath your leg and you're going to use your hand that's not on the steering wheel to surprise the cop with a shot in the face, you've got to be able to shoot a revolver or shoot a pistol left-handed. And 90% of the people in the world are right-handed. So it means not only is it hard to get a gun, but if a cop was to come up to your driver's side window, you'd have a hard time to coordinate firing sideways across your face with a pistol. So, yeah, that just doesn't happen in Australia. In America, they drive on the wrong side of the road because they were being rebellious against the British, and therefore they adopted the French Revolutionary drive on the wrong side of the road convention. And that means that when a cop walks up to the driver's side window, 90% of the people in the world are right-handed. So if they've got a pistol, and it's easy to get a pistol in America, the pistol is under their right-hand thigh, and they can have one hand on the steering wheel and go pop bang. So the American police are paranoid every time they go to work. They never know when they're going to be shot, and as a result, they behave like violent thugs and arseholes. And Australia's cops didn't really start getting into that until we got flooded with television images of cop shows in the late 60s and 70s. And yeah, since then, Australian cops have been copying whatever they read in the Police Association Journal, and the Police Association Journal in Australia pulls lots of its articles from the Police Association and union journals from the excited status. So because we're sort of like the 51st state, we don't get to elect the president, but we go wherever America wants. And anytime we think America wants to go to war somewhere, we're like the pet attack trained chihuahua who goes out barking first to try and, either provoke the shit fight or provoke other people to come to America's supportive defence. Like we pledged support for both President Bush's Iraq excursions before anybody else in the world did. We beat the rest of NATO. Our ANZUS alliance obligations meant that we had to stick up for NATO's right to help America invade Iraq or bomb Iraq once and invade it, and invade it twice, occupy it once. Same with Absurdistan. In Vietnam, I think the Australian Army Advisor Corps had warrant officers posted to South Vietnam in 1962. Like, we were there long before America because we wanted America to have a war there. If America had a war in Vietnam, that'd keep Indonesia from ever wanting to become communist and invade Australia. And our other foreign policy option was bomb Jakarta. Bomb Jakarta was all we've really equipped our Air Force to do since 1947, because we got such a fright in 1942 when Singapore fell. Back to 1854 Yellow Peril fantasies, actually. Anyway, that gives you some idea of the milieu from which Peter Dutton and his Department of Interior Security has sprung from. That's why our head of the secret police got an AC or award, just like Bronwyn Bishop of Choppergate and Tony Abbott. And that's why, therefore, how come? And because all you have to do is advocate smoking pot, break a police windscreen, and joke about how it would have been much funnier if you just burnt the whole police station in order to get labelled a terrorist in Australia, because you have violently advocated for changing an Australian law because of an ideological or religious or political conviction. And that's why people like me consider that Australia has, within our lifetimes, transmogrificated from a free country into a police state. And in my personal opinion, the hard, sharp demarcation line of transition, it didn't actually come when the CIA deposed Gough Whitlam. It didn't come with Malcolm Fraser. Really, it came when Nelson Mandela was let out of jail in South Africa, because before then, the only white South Africans you saw in Australia were the good ones. They were the ones who couldn't stand living in a slave-based economy, so they ran away and they abandoned all their money. The South African government would let them go away, but they wouldn't let them sell their house and turn it into money and then run away with the money, or turn it into diamonds or gold. They wouldn't let them do that. In fact, the last good white South African came to Glen Innes eventually, and what he did was he built a boat, a sailing boat. He built it in his backyard, and then he moved it to the water and he launched the boat. It was ferro concrete, and then when it was good enough to camp on with a tent, then he sold his house and used his house to finish fitting out his boat, loaded it up with supplies, and he said to the Whaite South African government, "Cheerio, old chaps, I'm going for a bit of a test sail." And he showed up in Australia and claimed political asylum, or whatever it was that you had to do to get into Australia, back when Nelson Mandela was in jail. And we said, yeah, fucking good on you, mate. Well done. Come over here. And then he sailed around to Sydney and he sold his boat, and he got a good money for that, and then he bought a bus, and then he bought a block of land, and then he built a house, and, you know, like, Whaite South African government. He got out of there before they let Nelson Mandela out. Once they let Nelson Mandela out of jail, when he became the president of not Whaite South Africa, the South African Republic, he said to all of the white fellas who'd been stuck there because they couldn't leave their money behind, he said, piss off, we don't want you. If you don't want to live in a free and democratic South Africa, you can take your money and you can run away. You don't have to hide or do anything, just piss off, go away. And they did. But before they did, they looked all over the world, and where could you go where a white person could be really fucking horrible to a black person? You can't do it in North America, they'll sue you. They didn't want to live in South America because it's, you know, great way to lose money going over there. It's politically unstable and it's unprofitable. Rest of Africa, that's why they retreated to white South Africa after Rhodesia fell. Go to Europe and you've got to treat blackfellas like white fellas over there. You're like they're full citizens. You can't carry on any of your KKK fantasies in anywhere in Europe. And somebody at the South African Bureau of Running Away said to him in the dying days, look, General Jan Smuts, the Boer War general who beat the crap out of the British until, you know, he ran out of supplies and they overwhelmed him. And then he fought for the British in the First World War, and he was a big war hero. In the 1920s, he went to a place called Queensland in Australia, and he looked at how they ran the native police. And they used Aborigines from one part of the country to conduct punitive raids in another part of the country. And he came back and he wrote the apartheid regime based on what he saw of the Queensland native policing system. So if you want to go anywhere in a world where a white person can treat a black fella like shit, you go to Australia. And at that point in time, Johnny Howard said, we're going to inaugurate the busyness migration scheme. And anybody anywhere in the world who can prove they've got $1 million US or more in a bank account, they're welcome to come to Australia as a busyness migrant. And that was at the same time he was telling absolute fucking lies about babies allegedly thrown overboard in order to morally inspire and coerce Australian naval members to rescue them and therefore bring them to Australia without paperwork. Yeah, Johnny Howard, by allowing rich white South Africans who didn't want to live in a democracy to come over to Australia and bring their desire for having a fucking handgun in every room so they can, you know, shoot their missus or their girlfriend through the toilet door and pretend they thought it was an intruder. They were all invited to come over here. Yesterday there was a riot in Long Bay Jail where they used so much fucking tear gas, they tear gassed the bloody neighbours on the other side of the wall twice in one afternoon. And you listen to the head of the New South Wales Corrective Services Board making apologies. It's a fucking white South African. All of the people who used to make their living strutting around like pompous fucking peacocks in their jackboots in white South Africa, they run to Australia and got a job in the prisons department. And they wonder why they're rioting. So with all of that shit as a background, did you hear about Rio Tinto up in the Kimberley? In 2013, they got an approval to extend their mine in a particular direction, an iron ore mine it is. And that meant to fill in the protocol and tick the boxes on the paperwork, they had to fund archaeologists to go out there and make sure there was nothing of archaeological importance which might slow down their mine. And the archaeologists came back in 2014 and they said, well, actually, out there's one cave that's 46,000 years old and it has paintings on the walls and stone flakes and bones and, you know, like tools, and it's the oldest known habitation, you know, where we can sort of get DNA from. And therefore the mining company said, that's great, what else is out there? There's heaps of it, there's caves all over the fucking place. And the mining company said, well, you better go and make a movie about it. Here's some money, go and talk to the local tribes in order to make a movie about it. So they did that in about 1917, I think, 2017 rather. And then somebody said to the local land council up there, listen, do you realise that they've already drilled that whole area and they're currently putting explosives in the holes and they're planning on blowing it up in about, like a fortnight? So the local Aborigines and the traditional owners of the land, they got onto Canberra to the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, and they said, hey, what's going on? And don't talk to us. This is a state matter. You have to talk to Western Australia. Here's the telephone number of the people in the West Australian government. And they got in touch with the West Australian government, whereas the legislation says that it's against the law to disturb any form of archaeological remains. Section 18 of the regulation says that the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs in Western Australia, he can sign off on an exemption so the mining company can do whatever they fucking want to. So they blew up a pair of 43,000-year-old caves while George Floyd was having his neck tromped on and being suffocated in the excited status of Norte Armed Americano. And this is, I remind you, what's today? It's the 9th. So it's 250 years, 1 month and 10 days since Lieutenant Commander James Cook, on behalf of the Admiralty in London, working at the direction of the British Crown for the entire imperial realm, shot the first Australian Aborigine that England ever encountered, which he did on the 29th of April, 1770, at Kurnell, and then stole the shield with the bullet hole in it and put it in a fucking English museum. So yeah, we've come a long way, haven't we? And whereas in New Zealand, they've had no bloody corona cases for so long that they've just declared themselves corona-free, and then they've dissolved all of their lockdown procedures because Jacinta Ardern is a whole lot more forceful and leadership-driven than Slow-Mo here in Australia. All over the world, a whole bunch of people have decided that, there's not enough old people catching corona fast enough. They'll just have to go out on the streets and get themselves tear gassed so that they spit and cough and spray tears and body fluids all over each other, as if that's really kind of going to help, All I've noticed is that since the American police went crackers with tear gas, the Australian police have decided, oh, well, fuck, they're getting to use their tear gas. We better have a crack too, Look, there's a few fellas having a bit of a punch-up in Long Bay because, somebody didn't get the expected drug drop over the wall. Let's tear gas the cunt out of them. Because all the people who work in and command the prisons department are experienced South African mercenaries. I mean veterans. I mean immigrants. Naturalised Australians all, I'm sure. Apparently in Western Australia they live in gated enclaves behind barbed wire because, that's their natural environment, and they agitate constantly to try and have Australia's gun laws changed because they feel naked if they walk around without a gun. Yeah. And somebody who believes in Aboriginal law and marijuana law reform, who broke a police car window, or 2 police cars' windscreens, and said he should have burnt the police station when he was in jail joking with a bunch of other prisoners, he got put on a terrorist order for 3 months. And while he was on the terrorist order, he couldn't rent a house, he couldn't leave New South Wales, he wasn't allowed to go and visit his dying father, and his father died, and he couldn't go to the funeral. Because we live in a PoLice state. A state where government money is paid to a bunch of people who think that they need to patrol the streets to clean up the human lice, who they see as infesting the streets. See, in their mind, there has to be a bunch of bad people and criminals who infest the streets. That's why they are paid to patrol them. They take their name as the PoLice Patrol from southeastern England, when public houses were suffering an infestation of pediculosis pubis. So every day somebody was paid to go into every room in every pub and take the chamber pot, a ceramic pot that lived under the bed for people to shit and piss in during the night because they had no plumbing in England in those days. And you'd take the chamber pot and you would empty it and you would wash it and you would boil it. And the pot had to be boiled, dipped into boiling water before being placed back into the bedroom. That was so that no customer would put crabs or lice onto the pot, which could then jump onto the next customer the next day. So there was a PoLice patrol, and William Richard Peel, when he was petitioning the London Municipal Council because of alleged lawlessness on the streets of London because of an economic downturn, he advocated for the establishment of a civilian militia to patrol the streets and clear them of the human scum and parasites, much as the PoLice patrols do in public houses. And that's where the PoLice patrol got its name. Their entire tradition stems from the idea that they are set out to eliminate subhumans. And they've never really recovered from the nature of their beginnings. You can't go out and lock people up and beat them and ill-treat them for pay for years without coming to resent them for making you do it to them. It's like abattoir workers. They come to hate the animals that they kill because they feel so bad about killing them, and then they blame the animals for making them feel so bad for killing them. So they beat the shit out of them. Self-righteous killing never ends well. Ask Derek Chauvin, the chauvinist policeman from Minneapolis, Minnesota, who ordered his minions to help him kill a suspected perpetrator who may have knowingly passed a counterfeit, or what was reported to be a counterfeit bill. Yeah, here in Australia, we live in a fucking secret police state where the head secret policeman gets an AC award, an Australian commander. For doing shit like locking up that bloke by the name of George Dixon, or somebody Dixon, the South Australian, stranded in New South Wales after being busted for smoking a joint at the Nimbin Marijuana Festival, after annoying the police and the politicians by writing emails to them advocating for law reform. This is what the marketing department of Hollywood and television's movie-making industry has transformed Australia into becoming. Really, it's enough to give diarrhea the shits when you think about it. But, you know, such is life. I am privileged to live in a remnant where I can remember how good it used to be back in the day. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.